In Unit 8, we'll be looking at how America at war goes from the Second World War, active war, bullets and bombs and the like, into a Cold War, which is characterized without direct fighting. Definitely lots of conflict, but not direct fighting. To understand the Second World War, however, we have to go back to the United States following the First World War. Most Americans wanted to stay neutral and out of the conflict in Europe during the First World War, but when we were pulled into it, we did actually benefit from it. However, a Republican senator in the 1930s, Senator Nye, called those who profited from the war merchants of death. And by this, he meant arms manufacturers, cargo companies, people that financially benefited from the war. And in a sense, almost probably wanted the country to go to war in order to gain those benefits. During the 1920s and 30s, America definitely has an isolationist sensibility about it. They don't want to get involved in other people's. And also in the 1930s, we now have the Great Depression. We have our own problems to deal with. So in 1935, the Congress passes the Neutrality Act, which means that there will be no selling or exporting of material. So we in no way want to engage with anything militant. Now in the 1930s, no one's at war in 1935, but America is definitely seeing what is happening in the world. Even though there might not be a clear European war like there had been before, there's definitely tension. For instance, with Japan. Japan had taken Korea in 1910, and this has essentially been okayed by the Treaty of Portsmouth after the Russo-Japanese War. And from there, Japan goes to take the Chinese territory of Manchuria, which they call Manchukuo. So that's very aggressive. And of course, in the 1930s, we also have the growth of the Nazi Party and Hitler. So by the mid-1930s, we have Nazi Germany, fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini, and we have the Empire of Japan, all that are very aggressive in wanting and often taking territory. In 1939, President Roosevelt's State of the Union address, which is the very beginning of the year, it's almost always in January, he is speaking to these threats. And he says, a war which threatened to envelop the world in flames has been averted, but it has become increasingly clear that world peace is not assured. So what he's saying is all of the efforts of the global community to avoid war following the First World War have failed. And there are things that are now threatening world peace and democracy and freedom. Roosevelt goes on to say, quote, events abroad have made it increasingly clear to the American people that dangers within are less to be feared than dangers from without. If, therefore, a solution of this problem of idle men and idle capital is the price of preserving our liberty, no formless selfish fears can stand in the way, end quote. So what Roosevelt is saying is he is actually very pro-war in the sense that he wants to come to the aid of freedom-loving nations. And he talks about freedoms in the speech, the four freedoms: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion or freedom of belief. But with regards to wars and protecting these ideas of freedom and democracy, Roosevelt really wants to start helping his friends in Europe, especially Britain and France. However, most of the country doesn't really care, thinks that this is none of our business still. So in 1939, this is at the point when Germany has taken Austria, they have invaded Czechoslovakia, and then on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, and many historians consider that to be the beginning of the war. The 1939 Neutrality Act is often called the Cash and Carry Act. This removes the arms embargo that had been created just a few years earlier, 1935, and it says that all terms of trade with belligerent nations, so this is saying to any country, we will trade with you, but only on a cash and carry basis, which means we will sell you material, but you've got to pay for it in cash, and you're going to have to ship it yourself. American ships are not going to carry the burden and the risk, because remember, in the First World War, we had unrestricted submarine warfare. The isolationists agree to this because it is really limiting any potential risk for the United States. France had ordered a shipment of planes, but before they could take delivery of it, Germany took over. So America will transfer that sale to the British. Roosevelt thought this was a really important element of America's place in the world, that we could be the arsenal of democracy, that our production, our factories could help produce the material to fight those who are threatening freedom. So in a sense, he is kind of clearly saying, but not actually saying, who he is siding with. Again, America is not at war, but we are preparing as if we are at war. In 1940, the Burke-Wadsworth Act is passed. This is also known as the Selective Service and Training Act. This requires that men between 21 and 36 years of age register, and drafted soldiers would stay in the Western Hemisphere or any United States-controlled territories. This is making sure that there are going to be men that are able to fight in case, which is looking like it, in case we end up going to war. So this passes in September of 1940, and men start to train in October of 1940. FDR is really saying that this is about defense. This isn't about making war. This is about being able to protect ourselves. So we have to be prepared in case anyone were to attack us. We have no intention of being aggressive, of going on the war path. Even though America is not at war, Britain and the rest of Europe are at war in October of 1940. We are simply preparing for war just in case. In the midst of all this, we have a national election. Many people thought that it was wrong of FDR to run because this would be his third term if he were to be elected. His main contender is the Republican Wendell Willkie, and FDR wins with 55%. And he says he intends to keep the United States out of war. He does not want to repeat the same mistakes that Woodrow Wilson made. However, FDR is definitely choosing sides in all of this. This becomes even more clear in 1941 with the Lend-Lease Act. What this does is it sort of adjusts the cash and carry program of just a year and a half earlier in 1939. The Lend-Lease Act says that the U.S. will lend material, meaning warships, planes, and we'll loan them to the Allied nations in return for leases for military bases. So we will lend them the supplies that they need for war in order to get a lease for military bases. And this is because, especially Britain, has run out of cash. But FDR doesn't want to give up on supporting Great Britain. He said in a press conference, "I don't say, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. Boop. FDR tried to explain the Lend-Lease Act in a press conference, and someone said it would be like lending your neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire in his house. And the president said, well, I don't say, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. And he says, I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire. Now, if you think of lending war stuff, that can be kind of tricky. And the Republican Senator Taft from Ohio figured out this exact problem. He said, quote, lending war equipment is a good deal like lending chewing gum. You don't want it back. And that's exactly what's going to happen. We're not going to get back most of this stuff. And we will begin to lend material to all of our allies in time, which will include Great Britain, France, Russia, and even China. The next step of making FDR and America's allegiance clear is the Atlantic Charter in summer of 1941. This is kind of a joint meeting between FDR and Churchill. Churchill sails over in a submarine in order to meet with FDR in Newfoundland. And this is a major deal. These guys have been talking on the phone for several years. And what they decide that this is going to be our intentions, and they call themselves the United Nations versus the Axis. And they talk about some of the things that they would like to see accomplished by this war. What can we fix? That maybe we want to protect freedom, we want to protect democracy. We're not seeking land. So unlike the problems in the First World War. Now, America is still not engaged in war, but we get pretty close. In the fall of 1941, there are 3 different boats that are attacked. The Reuben James was part of a convoy sending materiel to Britain. The Greer was fired upon also in fall of 1941, but Germany says that the Greer fired first. And the Kearney was also in a convoy and came out to assist a British naval vessel. All of this is sort of demonstrating that we are going to be pulled into this war. It is simply a matter of time. So the American government comes up with what it calls the Victory Plan. And the whole purpose of this Victory Plan is to understand right now we are most likely going to be engaged in a 2-front war. Our 2 fronts, unlike the First World War and Germany's 2 fronts, our 2 fronts are going to be Japan and Germany. The decision is made in this Victory Plan that we will need to deal with Germany first, and that's really because they are going to be closer. The Atlantic Ocean is much smaller. Then we can deal with Japan, and the estimate for being ready to do this was that America would be ready by 1943.